Today, we'll be looking at Heidegger's concept of authenticity. Just note though, this is an early form of authenticity and not what Canadian thinkers refer to with this word. However, it's still important to grasp Heidegger's authenticity because some of his concepts will be helpful in understanding the Canadian variant, which I'll eventually cover. Heidegger is known for his technical jargon, but because my goal is to speak philosophy to a general audience, I've replaced his technical jargon with common words. Obviously, some Heideggerian purists will not be happy with this move, since it may reduce the accuracy of certain of his concepts and invite conflation. But my presentation is not meant to replace his works, simply to introduce them in manageable steps. So we'll make do. The first thing we need to understand is that Heidegger's approach is phenomenological. That is a key term I could not replace. Phenomenology means that the person is the point, the location where existence happens, the only place where one can have the unique comprehension for being. It isn't simply that inert, detached, disengaged, objective rationality that is so prevalent in thinking today. It explores and describes the essence of human experiences and the meaning people attribute to them. It focuses on consciousness, the nature of the subjective, how individuals perceive and make sense of the world they experience. So the person and his lived experience is the point, the location where one can grasp reality. You cannot separate the individual and his lived experience from reality. Experience is significant. You cannot factor it away. In fact, you are interested in this structure of existence. The second point is that existence begins in an already given historical and cultural context. It's not like René Descartes and his reduction of everything to I think, therefore I am, and then start rationalizing, or the hypothetical narratives building on a imaginary state of nature, which is either good or bad, such as John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau. No, the human living beings begins by first acknowledging the lived and concrete situation of the person. We are born at a particular place and time which extends beyond us and is not of our choosing. That means that the starting position for the person is in a manufactured life. The person is already in an a priori context of meaning that has been predetermined and pre-interpreted. The manufactured life has already decided the manner in which the person should live, what things are valuable, what roles are worthwhile, what projects are important to pursue, and so on and so forth. The manufactured life is best understood as the force of, let's say, the establishment elites, for lack of a better word, which put things into place, and then the unreflected acceptance of those things by the majority. We are just describing the situation here, though, stating a fact of being. We're not putting any value judgments on these things right now, whether it's good or bad. And although we are not putting any value judgments on these things right now, we do need to recognize one thing, that there is one thing pernicious about the manufactured life. And that is that the manufactured life hides the fact that it has relieved the person of the burden of explicitly choosing what it wishes to be. Regardless of whether the things put forth by the manufactured life are good or bad, the fact remains that most unreflectively accept it and thus are not properly choosing for themselves. As a consequence of the manufactured life also, a certain leveling effect takes place, and all that is unique and creative is stifled. This renders everything common, comparable, and interchangeable. And thus, a certain drive towards homogeneity takes place, which in turn encourages mediocrity and complacency. So, because the person's already constituted immersion in the manufactured life, he automatically and unreflectively surrenders his own potentiality for being a true self in order to dwell in the tranquilized familiarity. The tranquilized familiarity is everydayness. Everydayness refers to two things: the normal day-to-day activities of everyday living, which we're all common with, but also the surface level acceptance of things, to regard things superficially, usually accepting what everyone says about things, and the person's natural tendency to conceal things from himself. So, what is being concealed? What is this burden we are being relieved of? In short, authenticity and the desire to be a whole self, to be a being towards the end. We'll get back to this later, but first, we'll explore how one arrives at being aware that one has to become himself. Because the person is by default part of the mass, the manufactured life, something is needed to jolt the person out of his lethargy, his enslavement. He thus needs an experience with death, with dissolution. This is how one becomes aware that he must become himself. One must bear in mind that the experience of dissolution through death is not necessarily relegated to the actual physical event. I just want to make a tangent and highlight that this death dissolution experience is what we see in the Bible. When Adam dies from eating the fruit, it's not a physical death. Just think of the Genesis narrative. Um, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat it, you shall die. That was what God said to Adam and Eve. But Adam's physical body did not cease to function. Rather, God banished him from the Garden of Eden to cultivate the ground which he was taken.
It's like, well, if God said that they would die, why don't they just drop dead? Why don't they just eat the fruit and drop dead?
Anyways, back to Heidegger. Death is that moment when the person confronts the contingency of human reality in all of its complexity. When meaning of any kind is ruptured or destroyed on any level, and what is revealed is the precariousness of the person's own world. At a more profound level, the loss of a set of meaning or values exposes it to an even deeper realization of the fictive nature of its own experience. This type of death experience ought to enable the person to face the arbitrariness of its own existence, as well as facing the burden of having to choose its own potentiality for being. Heidegger considers death to be the primordial horizon out of which human authenticity is made possible. Death forces the person to face its own potentiality. The person chooses it. The person chooses its own possibilities for being such and such in the light of its own potential nothingness. So death dissolution is the rupture that opens the person up to the possibility of being authentic. It also opens up the call to conscious. This can be likened to the person's everyday interpretation of himself. As call, conscience discloses to the person the need to break away from his inauthentic form of existence. The person now confronts itself as a being that must decide what it wishes to be, how it wants to constitute its own self. In short, authenticity. The call itself is indefinite. It is only a call to possibilities. It has no specific content, but it does have a sure direction. It is directed to the subject's self. And this self for Heidegger, by the way, is not an inward such as Rousseau and a lot of what we see in popular culture today. So there has been advancements or changes in authenticity. So after the rupture, the death experience, the person can be described as an event, a dynamic movement towards the possibility of being a self that is whole. The person is an entity which does not just occur amongst other entities. It is distinguished from others by the fact that being is an issue for it. An issue in the sense that he is an open question, one that needs to be settled ultimately by the person himself, a question of self-interpretation. But as we saw, his interrogation is situated within a historically and culturally language context that is already given. It cannot be adequately addressed outside of this lived matrix. So the person's interrogation of being always begins with everydayness. Furthermore, the person's world is ordered around what he considers most pressing. That is, his concern for being, his attention. This concern for being sets the subject apart from every other person, which are simply what they are, without being concerned for what they are or what they could be. It is only by virtue of this concern that the person can relate to other beings and even to himself. This reveals that the essence of the person is relational. It is a way of being rather than a mere what of being. The person is not to be thought of as primarily a particular being, but more as a possibility of being such and such, which the self offers to itself for realization. The person can become itself only by realizing that his being, his self being actualized, is uniquely and properly his own. Man's being is not from the beginning a fait accompli, but something that he must achieve, a task in which he can default. And if he is not a fait accompli, this means that there is guilt associated with his existence. In fact, there are two types of guilt: inauthentic guilt and authentic guilt. Inauthentic guilt is hearing the call to conscience, but nevertheless surrendering one's own potentiality in favor of the manufactured life. The person is guilty because his choice is to surrender the possibility of being a whole self, the surrendering to the everydayness of human living, the person falling into being absorbed by the manufactured life, an unreflective set of choices, decisions whereby the subject has moved away from its potentiality for being a self to fall into the humdrum flow of every day-to-day everydayness. The second type of guilt is authentic guilt. Authentic guilt is if the person hears the call to conscience and follows that. The person chooses to bear the burden of its own possibilities. But because the person is always less than its full potential, it is always less than what it should be. Therefore, the person is always and everywhere guilty of not being what it should be. This is authentic guilt. Authentic existence demands the person to retrieve its heritage over and against tradition. Meaning and values that constitute the givenness of life have become hardened by tradition. It is what masks and covers and even encrusts. So tradition is dead for Heidegger. So tradition must be brought back to life, back to consciousness. When this is achieved, Heidegger uses the term heritage rather than tradition. Heritage symbolizes those authentic possibilities that enable the person to be an authentic self, to have an authentic sense of historicity. To be authentic, the person must recover that deeper undercurrent of historical meaning that course beneath the fads and fancies of today and take them over as the fundamental resources for its own being. The burden we are being relieved of when surrendering to the humdrum of everyday manufactured life is being authentic and being in a world. But being in the world is not in the purely spatial sense. Rather, it's a sense of being at home, a matrix of meaningfulness, an organized whole, a context of meaning, in which it is possible for the person to have a relationship with its own being and the being of others. It is a profound intimacy, being entrusted with a privileged familiarity with the world and the total set of relations in which human living takes place. So this was a quick overview of Heidegger from the book Meaning and Authenticity to set the stage for Bernard Lonergan and Charles Taylor. I'll develop this in later presentations, but it's important to know that Heidegger's authenticity is not Canadian authenticity. There are some commonalities, though, such as the Canadian engaged human agency it has parallels with Heidegger's person that we explored today. However, Heidegger's authenticity is not about exploring your inner self. It's about seizing your true culture, your heritage, whatever that is, and Heidegger turned out to be a Nazi supporter, so, definitely some issues with that philosophy there. Heidegger's authenticity is also its being towards death and dissolution. Ultimately, this closes off the possibility for any real transcendence. Canadian thinkers posit that authentic. Canadian thinkers posit that inauthentic. My gosh, I'm just stumbling over my words on my last slide. So, Canadian thinkers posit authenticity includes more than appropriating the finitude of one's being. Contrary to the relativism that seems inherent in the idea of Heidegger's authenticity, Canadian thinkers assert that there is, in fact, a moral ideal, a normativity behind the desire for self realization. All right, so I didn't mess that up too bad. I'll see you guys next week. I think, well, we'll see what I do next week, what topic I cover. All right, good week, everyone.